The Oklahoma Territory in the summer of 1889 was a landscape of both promise and chaos, still settling from the famous land run that had opened millions of acres to settlement just months before. Daniel Hayes had been one of the thousands who had raced across the border when the cannon fired, staking his claim to 160 acres of rolling prairie crossed by a clear creek and dotted with groves of cottonwood trees. At 42 years old and recently widowed, Daniel had seen the land run as a chance for a fresh start, an opportunity to build something new from the ground up and perhaps find purpose in work and solitude. The property Daniel had claimed was beautiful but challenging, requiring constant attention as he built a cabin, established fences, and began the slow process of turning wild land into a working ranch. He spent his days riding the boundaries of his claim, checking for encroachment by neighboring settlers, identifying the best locations for corrals and outbuildings, and planning where to plant crops and graze the cattle he hoped to acquire. The work was exhausting but satisfying, giving him something to focus on, besides the grief that still caught him unexpectedly when he thought about the wife he had lost to pneumonia the previous winter. On this particular morning, Daniel was exploring the eastern section of his property, an area he had not yet thoroughly investigated. The land here was less open prairie and more wooded, with a substantial grove of mature cottonwood trees surrounding a bend in the creek where the water ran deep and clear. As Daniel rode through the trees, enjoying the shade and the sound of water over rocks, he noticed something that made him rein in his horse and look more carefully. Through the dense foliage, he could just make out the weathered boards of a structure, a small shack that appeared to have been built years ago and then abandoned. Daniel dismounted and approached carefully, his curiosity piqued by this unexpected discovery. The shack was tiny, perhaps 12 feet by 12 feet, built from rough-hewn lumber that had weathered to silver gray. The roof sagged dangerously in the middle, and one wall leaned at an angle that suggested the whole structure might collapse in the next strong wind. It had clearly been abandoned for some time, probably built by an early homesteader who had given up and moved on, leaving this remnant of failed dreams slowly returning to the earth. But as Daniel came closer, he noticed details that did not fit the story of long abandonment. The door, though hanging crooked on leather hinges, had been propped shut from the inside with what looked like a sturdy branch. Fresh footprints, small ones, marked the muddy ground near the entrance. Most telling, a thin curl of smoke rose from a gap in the roof, so faint Daniel had almost missed it, suggesting a carefully maintained fire that someone was trying to keep hidden. Someone was living in this shack, and whoever they were trying very hard not to be found. Daniel called out in a friendly voice, announcing his presence and explaining that this was his property, but that he meant no harm. The silence that followed was so complete that Daniel almost convinced himself he had imagined the signs of habitation. But then he heard it, the faintest sound of movement inside the shack, a shifting of weight on old floorboards, the soft catch of frightened breathing. Someone was definitely inside, hiding and hoping he would give up and leave. Daniel tried again, his voice gentle and patient. He said he knew someone was there, that he was not angry or threatening, and that he simply wanted to understand the situation. He explained that this land was his legal claim, but that he was a reasonable man willing to talk about whatever circumstances had led to someone sheltering in this abandoned structure. The silence continued, but Daniel could sense the presence inside, could almost feel the fear and uncertainty radiating from the decrepit building. After several more attempts at conversation yielded no response, Daniel decided to investigate more directly. He carefully opened the door, the wood scraping against the dirt floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet grove. The interior of the shack was dim, lit only by the gaps in the walls and the filtered sunlight coming through holes in the roof. Daniel's eyes adjusted slowly, taking in the sparse contents. A small fire pit made from stones in one corner with coals still glowing faintly, a pile of grass and leaves that had been formed into a makeshift bed, a few tin cans that had held food, and a bucket near the door that had been used to carry water from the creek. But what Daniel did not see was the person he knew must be there. He stepped further inside, looking around carefully, and then he heard a small gasp from above. Looking up at the exposed rafters, Daniel's heart clenched with surprise and concern. Wedged between two beams, pressed as far back into the shadows as possible, was a child, A girl perhaps 10 years old, with tangled blonde hair and a dirt-smudged face, wearing a torn dress that had once been white but was now stained with mud and grass. She stared down at Daniel with eyes that were wide with terror, her small body trembling, but her jaw set with determination not to cry or beg. Daniel immediately stepped back, giving the child space and making his posture as non-threatening as possible. He spoke softly, telling her he was not going to hurt her, that he just wanted to understand why she was hiding in this shack on his property. The girl remained silent, but Daniel could see her calculating, trying to decide if he was telling the truth or if this was some kind of trick. Daniel sat down on the floor, making himself smaller and less intimidating, and simply waited, showing through patience and stillness that he was willing to let her set the pace of their interaction. Minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by the sounds of the creek and the wind rustling through the cottonwood leaves outside. Finally the girl spoke, her voice hoarse from disuse and fear. She said her name was Lucy, that she was 10 years old, and that she was not going anywhere, not to an orphanage, not to strangers, not to any place where people would decide what happened to her without asking what she wanted. Her voice cracked with emotion as she explained that she had lost her parents during the land run, that there had been an accident with their wagon, and that by the time the dust settled, she was alone with no family and no home. Lucy described how she had been taken briefly by territorial authorities, who said they would place her in an orphanage back east, where she would be cared for and educated. But Lucy had heard stories about orphanages, about children being treated as unpaid labor, about families being separated and identities being erased. She had run away before they could transport her, surviving in the wilderness for weeks by stealing food from unguarded camps, fishing in creeks, and hiding in abandoned structures like this shack. She had been living here for nearly 2 weeks, and it was the closest thing to home she had felt since losing her parents. Daniel listened to Lucy's story with growing sadness and admiration. This child had survived circumstances that would have broken many adults, showing resourcefulness and determination that spoke to a strong spirit, despite her young age and vulnerable situation. But he also understood the impossible position she was in. A 10-year-old could not survive indefinitely alone in the wilderness, especially as winter approached. Yet turning her over to authorities who would send her to an institution against her will felt like a betrayal of the trust she had just shown by telling him her story. As Daniel sat in that dilapidated shack, looking up at the frightened girl in the rafters, he realized he was facing one of those moments that would define who he was as a person. He could follow the law and report Lucy to the territorial authorities, ensuring she was placed in proper care, but also condemning her to exactly the fate she feared. Or he could find another way, something that honored both her independence and her need for protection, even if it meant bending rules and taking on responsibilities he had not anticipated. The choice would have consequences either way, but as Daniel looked into Lucy's desperate, hopeful eyes, he knew which path his conscience demanded he take. Daniel remained sitting on the floor of the shack for a long time, thinking through the options and implications of each possible choice. Lucy stayed in the rafters, watching him warily, her small hands gripping the wooden beam so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The silence between them was heavy with uncertainty, but it was not hostile. Both understood they were at a crossroads that would determine Lucy's future, and possibly Daniel's as well, and that whatever decision was made needed to be considered carefully rather than rushed. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice calm and measured. He told Lucy that he understood her fear of orphanages and her desire to maintain control over her own life. He acknowledged that the system designed to help children like her was flawed and sometimes caused more harm than good. But he also pointed out the harsh reality that a 10-year-old could not survive alone indefinitely. That winter in Oklahoma Territory could be brutal, and that living in a collapsing shack without adequate food or protection was not sustainable. Lucy's expression showed she knew this was true, even if she did not want to admit it. Daniel then proposed an alternative that surprised even himself as he voiced it. He said that his ranch needed help, that building a successful homestead required more labor than one person could provide, and that he had been considering hiring someone to assist with daily tasks. If Lucy was willing, she could work for him in exchange for room, board, and a small wage that would be saved for her future. She would live in his cabin, help with cooking, cleaning, and lighter ranch work appropriate for her age and strength, and in return would have shelter, food, and protection. Most importantly, she would maintain her independence and not be sent away against her will. Lucy looked at Daniel with suspicion and hope warring in her expression. She asked the questions that any sensible child would ask. Why would he help her when he did not know her? What would he expect in return beyond the work he mentioned? How could she trust that this was not just another way of trapping her into a situation she could not escape? Daniel answered each question honestly. He said he was offering help because it was the right thing to do, because he had lost his own family and understood loneliness, and because he believed that people should help each other when they could, especially when helping cost relatively little, but meant everything to the person receiving it. He acknowledged that his proposal required trust on both sides. Lucy would have to trust that he would treat her fairly and honorably, and he would have to trust that she would work hard and not run away the first time something was difficult or uncomfortable. Daniel suggested they try the arrangement for 1 month, after which either of them could end it if it was not working. He promised that if Lucy decided to leave, he would help her find a better situation, rather than simply turning her over to authorities. It was not a perfect solution, but it was an honest one that respected Lucy's autonomy while providing the structure and support she desperately needed. Lucy climbed down from the rafters slowly, her movements cautious, as if she expected Daniel to suddenly change and reveal himself as a threat. When she finally stood on the floor, Daniel could see how thin she had become, how her dress hung on a frame that should have been more robust for a girl her age. Her bare feet were cut and calloused from weeks of survival in the wilderness, and her arms showed scratches and bruises from the constant challenges of living rough. But her eyes, despite their wariness, still held a spark of defiance and intelligence that spoke to her unbroken spirit. Daniel extended his hand formally, as he would to any business partner, and asked if they had an agreement. Lucy looked at his hand for a long moment, then reached out and shook it with a grip that was surprisingly strong for such small fingers. The gesture felt significant, a mutual acknowledgement that they were entering into a real partnership based on respect rather than charity or obligation. Daniel felt a weight settle onto his shoulders as he realized he had just taken responsibility for another human life. But it was accompanied by a sense of rightness that told him this was where he was supposed to be and what he was supposed to be doing. They spent the rest of that day preparing for Lucy's transition from the shack to Daniel's cabin. First, they salvaged what little Lucy had accumulated during her weeks of survival. A tin cup, a small knife she had found, a blanket that was more holes than fabric, and a wooden box containing a few treasured items from her parents, including a photograph that had been bent and faded, but which Lucy guarded as her most precious possession. Daniel promised they would keep everything safe, that her parents' memory would be honored in her new home. The walk to Daniel's cabin took about 20 minutes, following the creek upstream to where he had built his main residence on a slight rise that offered good views of the surrounding property. The cabin was modest but well constructed, with solid walls, a good roof, and a stone fireplace that would provide warmth through the coming winter. Lucy entered hesitantly, her eyes taking in the single large room that served as kitchen, living space and bedroom, the furniture that Daniel had built himself, and the few personal items that spoke of his life before coming to Oklahoma Territory. Daniel showed Lucy where she would sleep, a corner of the cabin that he partitioned with a blanket hung from the rafters to provide privacy. He had a spare mattress filled with prairie grass that would be far more comfortable than her pile of leaves in the shack. He demonstrated where food was kept, explained his daily routine, and outlined the tasks she would be responsible for, helping prepare meals, maintaining the cabin's cleanliness, tending a small garden, gathering eggs from the chickens he planned to acquire, and other age-appropriate work that would contribute to the household while teaching her useful skills. Lucy listened carefully to everything Daniel said, asking occasional questions that showed she was intelligent and thoughtful. She wanted to know specific expectations, what would happen if she made mistakes, and what the boundaries were regarding her freedom to move around the property. Daniel appreciated her directness and answered with equal clarity. He said mistakes were expected and would be treated as learning opportunities rather than cause for punishment. that she could explore the property freely as long as she completed her assigned tasks and stayed safe, and that he would never strike her or treat her with the cruelty that she clearly feared based on stories she had heard about how orphans were sometimes handled. That first evening together was awkward but not unpleasant. Daniel prepared a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee, and Lucy ate with the desperation of someone who had been surviving on very little for too long. Daniel noticed but said nothing, simply ensuring her plate was full and that she knew she could have more whenever she wanted. After dinner, Lucy helped wash the dishes without being asked, showing that she understood the concept of contributing to the household and was willing to hold up her end of their agreement. As darkness fell and Daniel prepared for bed, he noticed Lucy standing by the window looking out at the prairie, illuminated by moonlight. He asked if she was all right, and she responded quietly that she was just not used to being inside walls, that the past weeks had made her feel more comfortable under open sky than enclosed in rooms. Daniel understood the feeling and told her that the adjustment would take time, that she should be patient with herself as she adapted to this new situation. Lucy nodded, and for the first time since he had discovered her in the shack, she smiled, just a small curve of her lips. But it transformed her face and gave Daniel hope that perhaps this unlikely arrangement might actually work. The first weeks of Lucy's presence on the ranch established patterns and routines that gradually evolved from awkward uncertainty into something resembling normalcy. She proved to be a remarkably capable worker for her age, approaching tasks with a seriousness and dedication that spoke to her determination to earn her place and maintain her independence. Daniel watched her adapt with a mixture of admiration and concern, noting how she pushed herself perhaps too hard, as if afraid that any sign of weakness or inadequacy would result in him revoking their agreement and sending her away. Lucy's responsibilities grew organically as she demonstrated competence and reliability. She took over most of the cooking, preparing simple but nourishing meals that improved dramatically as Daniel taught her techniques his late wife had used. She maintained the cabin with meticulous care, seeming to take pride in creating an organized, clean living space that was a stark contrast to the chaos of her weeks surviving in the wilderness. She helped in the garden, learning to identify weeds from vegetables and understanding the rhythms of planting and harvesting that would be essential for surviving Oklahoma's variable climate. But the work that Lucy seemed to enjoy most was anything involving animals. Daniel had acquired several chickens, and Lucy took responsibility for their care with enthusiasm that surprised him. She named each bird, learned their individual personalities, and seemed to genuinely enjoy the daily routine of feeding them, collecting eggs, and ensuring their coop was secure against predators. When Daniel brought home 2 young goats that would eventually provide milk, Lucy's face lit up with joy, and she spent hours each day with them, training them to follow her and respond to commands. Daniel found himself enjoying Lucy's presence more than he had anticipated. The cabin that had felt empty and echoing with loneliness now held life and purpose. There was satisfaction in teaching her new skills and watching her confidence grow as she mastered tasks that had seemed impossible at first. Their conversations over meals evolved from practical discussions about daily work into more personal exchanges, where Lucy began to share memories of her parents, and Daniel told stories about his late wife and the life he had lived before coming to Oklahoma Territory. However, challenges arose that tested the strength of their developing relationship. The first significant problem came when a neighboring rancher, a man named Samuel Porter, who had claimed land adjacent to Daniel's property, stopped by for a visit and was surprised to discover a child living at the cabin. Porter asked pointed questions about Lucy's presence, her relationship to Daniel, and whether proper authorities were aware of the situation. Daniel handled the questions carefully, explaining that Lucy was helping on the ranch and that he was providing care while attempting to locate distant relatives who might take her in, a story that was not entirely false but which obscured the more complicated truth. Porter seemed satisfied with the explanation, but warned Daniel that there had been increasing attention from territorial authorities regarding orphan children and proper placement procedures. The government was trying to establish order in the chaos following the land run, and part of that effort included ensuring children were not left vulnerable or exploited. Porter suggested, not unkindly, that Daniel should formalize Lucy's situation through proper legal channels to avoid potential complications. The conversation left Daniel troubled, recognizing that their informal arrangement might not be sustainable long-term without some kind of official recognition. The second challenge was more personal and emotional. One evening, about 6 weeks after Lucy had moved into the cabin, Daniel heard her crying quietly in her partitioned corner after she thought he was asleep. When he asked what was wrong, Lucy initially refused to answer, but Daniel's patient persistence eventually broke through her resistance. She admitted that she was terrified he would decide she was too much trouble and send her away. That she pushed herself so hard because she was trying to be valuable enough that he would want to keep her, and that the fear of losing another home and another family was almost unbearable. Daniel was moved by Lucy's vulnerability and heartbroken that she had been carrying this fear alone. He sat on the edge of her makeshift bed and told her with complete sincerity that she was not a burden or an obligation that he tolerated, but rather a valued presence that had brought life and purpose back to his days. He explained that when he lost his wife, he had thought his capacity for family connection had died with her. But Lucy had shown him that family could be built through choice and commitment rather than just blood relation. He promised her that as long as she wanted to stay, she would have a home with him, and that this was not contingent on her being perfect or never making mistakes. That conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Lucy began to relax, to show more of her natural personality rather than the carefully controlled version she had been presenting. She laughed more freely, asked for help when she needed it rather than struggling alone, and even occasionally challenged Daniel's decisions in ways that showed growing confidence in their relationship. Daniel found these changes encouraging, signs that Lucy was beginning to trust not just his words but the stability of their arrangement. As autumn approached and the prairie grass turned from green to gold, Daniel realized he needed to address the legal complications that Samuel Porter had warned about. He made a trip to the nearest territorial office, leaving Lucy in charge of the ranch for the day, a responsibility she took with utmost seriousness. At the office, Daniel spoke with a clerk about the process of becoming Lucy's legal guardian, a status that would provide both of them with protection and legitimacy that their current informal arrangement lacked. The clerk explained that guardianship required documentation, character references, and approval from territorial authorities who would investigate to ensure the arrangement served the child's best interests. The process would take time and would involve inspections and interviews that might be uncomfortable. But the clerk also noted that the territory was actively encouraging settlers to establish stable family units, and that a responsible man providing a good home for an orphan would likely be viewed favorably, especially given the overcrowded and underfunded state of existing orphanages. Daniel returned to the ranch with information and a decision. He explained the guardianship process to Lucy, emphasizing that it would make their arrangement legal and permanent, protecting her from being taken away as long as he could demonstrate he was providing appropriate care. Lucy listened carefully, then asked the question that Daniel realized had been weighing on her mind. Did he actually want to be her guardian? Or was he doing this because he felt obligated, or because it was legally necessary? Daniel answered with complete honesty that he wanted it, that she had become family to him in the months they had lived together, and that formalizing their relationship legally would simply be acknowledging what already existed in reality. The guardianship application process began, and while they waited for the official review, Daniel and Lucy continued building their ranch and their relationship. They added fencing to the property, prepared the cabin for the coming winter, and planned for the cattle Daniel hoped to purchase in the spring. Lucy continued her education informally, with Daniel teaching her reading, writing, and arithmetic in the evenings by lamplight, skills that would serve her well regardless of what future she ultimately chose. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sun set over the prairie in spectacular shades of orange and purple, Lucy asked Daniel a question that showed how much she had grown in confidence and trust. She wanted to know what would happen if the authorities denied the guardianship application, if they decided she needed to be placed in an orphanage despite Daniel's willingness to care for her. Daniel considered his answer carefully, then told her the truth. If that happened, They would figure out another solution, even if it meant leaving Oklahoma Territory and starting over somewhere else where the rules might be different or where they could live quietly without official recognition. He would not abandon her to a system that did not serve her interests. Regardless of what laws or officials demanded, Lucy smiled at this answer, reaching over to squeeze Daniel's hand in a gesture that had become their signal of mutual support and affection. She said she believed him, that for the first time since losing her parents, she felt like she belonged somewhere, and with someone who valued her for who she was, rather than seeing her as a problem to be managed or an obligation to be fulfilled. Daniel squeezed back, feeling grateful for the unexpected blessing that had come from discovering a hidden girl in a shack on his property, and for the family that had been built from loneliness, need, and the choice to see past circumstances to the human connection that mattered more than any legal document or social convention. The territorial inspector arrived on a crisp October morning, riding up to Daniel's ranch with the careful observation of someone trained to assess situations and make judgments that would affect lives. His name was Thomas Blackwell, a man in his 50s with gray in his beard and eyes that had seen enough of frontier life to be neither easily fooled nor unnecessarily suspicious. Daniel had prepared for this visit by ensuring the cabin was at its best. The property showed clear signs of productive work, and Lucy understood the importance of being honest, but also presenting their situation in the most favorable light possible. Blackwell spent several hours at the ranch, examining the living conditions, asking detailed questions about daily routines, and observing the interaction between Daniel and Lucy with professional scrutiny. He inspected Lucy's sleeping area, checked the food stores, and evaluated whether the cabin met basic standards for child welfare. He asked Lucy directly and privately whether she felt safe, whether Daniel treated her well, and whether she wanted to remain in his care or would prefer to be placed with a different family or in an institution. Lucy answered each question clearly and confidently, stating that she was happy, well cared for, and adamant that she wanted to stay with Daniel. Blackwell also interviewed Daniel extensively about his background, his plans for the ranch, his financial situation, and his motivations for taking responsibility for an orphaned child. Daniel answered truthfully, explaining his own loss and loneliness, his discovery of Lucy hiding in the shack, and his belief that sometimes the best way to help someone was to offer them dignity and partnership rather than charity or pity. He admitted that their arrangement had begun informally and perhaps not entirely in accordance with proper procedures, but argued that the outcome had been positive for both of them and that formalizing the guardianship would simply be recognizing a family bond that already existed. After completing his investigation, Blackwell sat down with both Daniel and Lucy for a final conversation. He began by noting several concerns. Daniel was a single man without family support. The ranch was still in its early stages, and financial security was not guaranteed, and there were some in the territorial government who believed children needed female caregivers to develop properly. However, Blackwell then proceeded to list the positive factors he had observed. The cabin was clean and well maintained. Lucy appeared healthy and was clearly receiving adequate nutrition. She was being educated and taught valuable skills, and most importantly, there was genuine affection and respect between guardian and child that could not be faked or manufactured. Blackwell's recommendation, which he delivered with a slight smile, was that the guardianship should be approved, with the condition that he would return in 6 months for a follow-up inspection to ensure continued appropriate care. He told Daniel that while their arrangement was unconventional, it was working well and served Lucy's interests far better than the available alternatives. He also noted, speaking with the frankness of someone who had seen the system's failures firsthand, that Lucy would likely have faced a difficult future in an overcrowded orphanage, and that she was fortunate to have found someone willing to provide genuine care rather than just institutional processing. The approval of Daniel's guardianship application arrived by post several weeks later, a formal document with official seals and legal language that transformed their informal arrangement into a recognized family relationship. Lucy held the paper with trembling hands, reading the words that meant she could not be taken away, that she had a legal right to the home and family she had found. Daniel watched her reaction with satisfaction, knowing that this piece of paper represented security and stability that no child should have to live without. The community's response to the formalized guardianship was generally positive, though not without some raised eyebrows and whispered questions. Most neighbors who had met Lucy and observed Daniel's ranch recognized that the arrangement was beneficial and were supportive. Samuel Porter, the neighbor who had first raised concerns, stopped by to congratulate Daniel and to admit that his initial skepticism had been proven wrong, that Lucy was clearly thriving and the ranch was prospering under their combined efforts. A few more traditional settlers maintained reservations about a single man raising a girl, but even they could not point to any actual problems or failures in the arrangement. As winter approached, Daniel and Lucy worked together to prepare the ranch for the cold months ahead. They insulated the cabin walls with mud and grass, stockpiled firewood, preserved vegetables from the garden, and ensured the animals had adequate shelter. These preparations gave them both confidence that they could weather whatever challenges the season might bring. Lucy had gained weight and lost the haunted, frightened look she had carried when Daniel first discovered her. She moved with confidence now, her laughter frequent and genuine, and she had begun to talk about future plans that extended beyond simple survival to genuine aspirations and dreams. One evening, as the first snow of winter began to fall softly outside the cabin windows, Lucy asked Daniel a question that had clearly been on her mind for some time. She wanted to know if she could start calling him something other than Daniel or Mr. Hayes, if perhaps she could use a term that reflected their actual relationship rather than the formal distance of their names. She was hesitant, clearly afraid of presuming too much or making him uncomfortable, but also needing to express the reality of how she felt about him and their life together. Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion as he understood what Lucy was asking. He told her that he would be honored if she wanted to call him something that reflected their bond, that she should choose whatever felt right to her. Lucy thought for a moment, then said quietly that Pa felt appropriate if that was acceptable to him. Daniel nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat, and Lucy smiled with relief and joy, trying out the word and finding that it fit perfectly, filling a space that had been empty since she lost her father in the land-run chaos. The months that followed established their life together on firmer ground. The ranch continued to grow and prosper as they added cattle in the spring and began generating modest income from their work. Lucy continued her education and also began helping with more complex ranch tasks, proving herself capable and resourceful in ways that went beyond her years. Daniel found that raising a child gave structure and meaning to his days that went far beyond simple economic survival, and he marveled at how his life had been transformed by the discovery of a frightened girl hiding in a shack. Inspector Blackwell returned for his 6-month follow-up visit and found the situation even more positive than it had been during his initial inspection. He filed a report recommending that no further monitoring was necessary, that the Hayes household was stable and thriving, and that Lucy was receiving care that exceeded any reasonable standard. The report officially closed Lucy's case, meaning she was now simply Daniel's daughter in the eyes of the law and society, no longer an orphan requiring special oversight or intervention. Years later, when Lucy was a young woman preparing to establish her own homestead on land adjacent to Daniel's property, they would sometimes talk about that day when he discovered her hiding in the rafters of a collapsing shack. Lucy would express amazement that Daniel had not simply reported her to authorities and moved on with his life, that he had instead chosen to offer partnership and family when he could have taken the easier path. Daniel would always respond the same way, saying that finding Lucy had not been a burden or an obligation, but rather a gift that had saved him as much as he had saved her, pulling them both from different kinds of wilderness into the warmth and security of family. The old shack where Lucy had hidden remained standing for several more years, gradually deteriorating until it finally collapsed entirely and was reclaimed by the prairie. But its location, in the grove of cottonwood trees beside the creek, became a special place for both Daniel and Lucy. They would sometimes ride there together, sitting quietly and remembering the chance encounter that had changed both their lives. The spot served as a reminder that sometimes the most important discoveries are not of land or resources, but of human connection, And that family is built not just through blood or legal documents, but through the daily choice to care for each other, to build trust through actions rather than words, and to honor the bonds that form when two people facing different kinds of loneliness decide to face the future together instead of alone.